Hi, welcome back. My name is Eileen Chevalier and I created the typewriter alphabet. These are the flashcards that we're using to study botany, and today we are going to look at annuals and perennials. Sadly, all plants will eventually die. Why do some live only for a few months and others continue to grow for hundreds of years? In this lesson, we'll look at annuals, perennials, and plants that can be both. So your materials for today, of course, you'll want to have your flashcards, and specifically we are going to look at the two last letters, so do it that way for you, our Y and our Z cards. And we're also going to look at Grow Your Soil, which is amazing. You should definitely get it and then buy copies for all your friends. I'm not getting paid to tell you that, but they're so good. All right, Smithsonian, DK Flora. All right, guys, so before we get those books, you're going to pull out your journal and I will read a couple of definitions for you. Annual, plants that complete their life cycle in 1 year. Perennial, plants that live beyond 1 year, often not mature enough to produce seeds for several years. All right, so before we look at our question and investigate for today, I'm going to read the Flora for you. So we are going to be on page 190 and 191. Okay. So here we are. It's going to talk about a couple of different, I know it says flower development, and that's a whole other thing, but it also talks about perennials and annuals. So herbaceous perennials, botanically, any plant that flowers and sets seed year after year, from the mighty oak to the humble geranium, is called perennial. In horticulture, however, the term refers mainly to non-woody plants. The phrase herbaceous perennial denotes any soft-stemmed plant, such as a peony, whose stems die back completely in the fall or winter, in contrast to the evergreen perennials, such as hellebores. So in the evergreens versus deciduous plants, we talked about the forsythia that loses all of its leaves in the winter, but there are other plants like the bleeding heart that completely die back underground in the winter. So you don't even know that they're there. This is my experience. In a house that we lived in years ago, it was phenomenal. We moved there in the summer, and then the next spring, all of these things appeared up out of the ground, including lots of bleeding hearts. And I had no idea they were there because they completely die back, so you can't see them at all. So those would be herbaceous perennials because they're tender, they're soft stemmed, and then they die back. So they are perennial, but they're herbaceous perennial, as opposed to the forsythia, which is a woody stem, right? So you can talk about those two things in that way. So flowers develop whenever a flowering plant is ready to reproduce. Life cycles range from weeks to years, depending on the species. Annuals germinate, flower, reproduce, and die within a year or less. Biennials spend a season developing from seed, rest over the winter, and bloom the following spring. So they have a 2-year. Bi is 2, just like bicycle, right? So annual is year. So biennial is 2 years. So their cycle takes 2 years. Perennials bloom every year and live for 3 or more years. So they don't always flower all of those years. So a lot of perennials, like if you think of fruit trees, a fruit tree grows for 5 years before it ever produces fruit because it's just growing. It's still in that beginning stage. Some trees, woody perennials, can live for centuries. So that's a little bit about perennials and annuals, and then I'll read you these because that's for our next question. So read your Y and X cards. How are the words perennial and annual related? What words can you think of with the same Latin roots? So we talk about those on these cards. So we'll start with the Y card. Yucca plants bloom in the summer, but their roots and stems stay alive for many years, making them perennial. Perennial means through, P-E-R, the first part of that word, through the years, which is ennial or annual, right? So remember, then the biennials, it was 2 years, and then perennial means through the years. Then on the Z card, zinnias are an annual, so they live for only 1 year. The Latin word annus means year. So 1 year, right? Annual, just 1 year. So are there other words that you can think of that use those words, annual or perennial? Often we talk about these as things that happen every year, even though it might not be about plants, but like, you know, the perennial spring cleaning. So like every year in the spring, you're like going to get rid of all your stuff that you realize you don't need anymore that just kind of accumulated. And and then annual, I remember when we had yearbooks. So like every year you get a yearbook, and they can be called yearbooks or they can be called the annual. So sometimes those are called the annual because it happens for that particular year. So see if you can think of other examples. Then the next question is, ecosystems need a variety of annuals and perennials. Why? What would happen to animals that need to eat early in the year if there were only perennials that bloomed in the summer? How do staggered bloom time and life cycle length support the entire ecosystem? So if you think back to when we were looking through the natural history, the DK Natural History book, and you looked through the monocots and you looked through the eudicots, and you saw that these plants are kind of everywhere, all over. And so in one ecosystem, you're going to have some types that are monocots and some types that are eudicots. The same thing happens with annuals and perennials, right? So we have some plants that stay every year. That tree is going to just be there throughout the years. And then you have some plants that are annual, so they're only going to be there for a year. The sunflowers come up and they bloom and they feed the bees and the butterflies, and then they die, and then they feed lots of other things like squirrels and chipmunks, and you've got all the seeds, us. So they only live for a year, and then they use their seeds, and then the next year they grow again. So there's a variety there. And just think about how that's important to an ecosystem to have both. Next up, visit a garden center and find the tags that give the zone, which just means area, where plants are hardy. Hardy just means that they will survive through the winter. Plants that are hardy in warmer areas can be sold in colder areas to be grown as annuals or as houseplants. So one of my favorite plants that I grew years and years ago was Plumbago, and it has these beautiful blue flowers, and so I grew it, and it was so gorgeous, and it got really big, and all summer it was gorgeous, and then winter came and it died and never came back. Then I went to Florida, and I was like, hey, I recognize that plant because I grew it. Those are Plumbago, and this was in February, and they were just all blooming. So I was like, oh right, they're hardy here in Florida, which is why they're still blooming and they're still growing. They're a perennial plant here. But in North Carolina, you would have to plant them every single year. So in that way, it would be an annual plant here and a perennial plant in a different place. You can also grow them as houseplants. So there are a lot of tropical plants. Or for instance, this jade, if I left the jade outside all winter, it would totally die. If you leave your Christmas cactus outside in the fall, it will help it set blooms. But if you leave it out all winter, it will kill the plant because it just can't survive the winter. It's not hardy. Well, here in North Carolina, it's not hardy, right? So depending on where you live, you could leave. In Louisiana, my grandmother had Christmas cactus, and she always kept them on her sun porch. It was screened in. So in the winter, it got really cold. But it was also Louisiana, so it didn't get as cold. And there was like the dryer was out there, and it was protected by the house. And so it didn't ever get like as cold as other places. And she might have brought it in on really cold nights. But I remember her Christmas cactus sat out on that porch. And even when it was cold, they were out there, but they didn't ever completely die. because it was hardy. They were hardy in that zone, in that climate. Plants, when you buy them, they'll have, if you look at the base, they usually have like a little piece of plastic that's stuck in there, and it will tell you if it's an annual or perennial and what zone it's hardy in. So it's helpful to know what zone you're in. All right, can you find plants, maybe even in your house, that aren't hardy in your area? Lastly, how does the type of compost affect the soil microbes? Do annuals or perennials prefer bacterially dominated compost? Which prefer fungally dominated compost? How can you ensure that plants get the type they need, and how does this happen in nature? All right, I thought this was fascinating. We are going to look and grow your soil. And on page 118, we're going to do 119 and read about fungally or bacterially dominated. Although all compost is good for all soil, certain types give more of a boost to different plants. In general, fast-growing, short-lived plants such as vegetables and annual flowers, so your annual plants, prefer bacterially dominated, higher nitrogen compost, and slower growing plants, so think of perennials, shrubs, trees, like their compost, fungally dominated. I think of the former as living fast and dying young and imbibing lots of bacteria and nitrogen along the way. Interestingly, the type of plant that you want to feed makes the kind of compost it wants to be fed. I'm going to read it again just because that's kind of a lot. So the type of plant that you want to feed, so if you are trying to feed an annual, makes the kind of compost it wants to be fed. So if you make compost out of annual plants, so you have your tomatoes and like in your garden, when you cut all those plants down after they're done producing and you put them into your compost pile, then they are making bacterially dominant compost. And then you put that same compost on your next vegetables that are growing quickly, and also our annuals. Then it's the plants themselves, all those annuals, when you compost them, the compost made of annual plants makes the kind of compost that annual plants want to have. So if you just think about like your garden and composting from your garden, all those plants that you're just growing for the season, and then you use that compost to feed the next ones. This makes sense when you think about it. Browner, slower growing plants drop leaves and branches, mulching themselves with organic matter that's friendly to fungi. So opposite of the example of the garden, if you have like a forest, or if you have, like we would have azaleas, like lots of azaleas right next to each other. So azaleas are dropping leaves, they're dropping branches, and all of those things are slowly decomposing. And just think about how slowly an azalea grows. You might get like 6 inches of growth, right? So it's a slower growing, like depending on how old the plant is, but it's a slower growing plant, and those leaves and branches are taking longer to decompose. So both of those are slow, and it's fungally dominated. With your garden, the plants are growing really fast. Think about how tall those tomato plants get. I mean, they get so tall, and then they just they go up 6 feet to the top of the thing that they're on, and then they just keep going back down the other side. So you've got like this 12-foot long plant. One season, months, like not even a whole year. So it grew very, very, very fast. And then when you compost it, it's composted so quickly, weeks, and you have totally finished compost. So it's growing quickly, it's composting quickly, it's bacterially dominated compost. The shrubs and the azaleas and the magnolias and all these trees, they're taking much longer to grow. Their compost is taking much longer to break down. And instead of being bacterially dominated, it's fungally dominated. All right, and fast-growing plants die and create greener, fresher mulch. Nature's got this. We try to replicate what nature is doing already with our compost and mulch. which is basically future compost. So the mulch, you know, if you use mulch from pine trees, like if you use pine bark mulch, that's great under trees and shrubs and perennials, but not so great maybe in the garden, right? Because it wants a different type of compost, wants a different kind of mulch. All right, super fascinating. Like I did not know that there was this difference between fungally dominated soil and bacterially dominated soil. So just think about that and how cool it is. And also think about the structure of fungi in the soil and how that relates versus the bacteria. If you're working in a garden, you're breaking up that soil a lot, right? So if you were doing that with the fungus, creates all those little networks through the soil. So if you're continually cutting them, it's harder for the fungus to dominate, right? Okay, next up, journaling activities. So first off, grow an annual angiosperm nasturtium sunflower zinnia from seed and record its life cycle. Collect leaves, flowers, and seeds to press into your journal. So annuals, very rewarding. You can do it any year. I brought a couple different seed packets. So this is zinnia, which is the Z that we just read the card for. It says annual right there on the top. And it gives you, there's a little zone map. It doesn't show you the names, and they're named by letters and numbers. So it's like 7A, 7B. We live in 7, which is why I'm saying that. But there are different zones throughout the United States, and it kind of mimics this. So it's telling you when to plant it outside, which is based on which zone you're in and where it is hardy. So that is an annual, and those are nice because it's going to happen in a season or, you know, a couple seasons, but it'll happen in a year. And then the other thing you can do is examine perennial stems to discover where last year's growth meets this year's growth. So that is a really interesting thing to think about, how it's growing over time, because if you plant a perennial right now, it's going to be a while for you to see those changes. So if you just choose a plant that's already growing, you can actually see where it was growing last year and then where it's growing this year. A lot of perennials, like if you think of hydrangeas, so they only bloom on the growth from last year. So if you cut it all back, there would be no blooms this year because it needs that woody stem from last year to set blooms on, because it starts setting them a lot earlier. Potentially you could get some that will bloom in the fall from the growth that's in the spring, but it doesn't happen right away. Like a zinnia, it goes up and it blooms. But with those woodier plants, then they need time. It takes longer. New growth on perennials is usually smooth and green. Compare the stems of annuals with perennials. Why is a bleeding heart stem like an annual? So bleeding heart is a perennial plant, but why? And you might want to think back to what we read here in Flora about the herbaceous perennials versus the woody perennials. Why would the bleeding heart have things in common with the annuals and not have as much in common with the hardy perennials? Record pictures and observations in your journal, just like always. And record them as you go along as well, so as you discover more plants, and hopefully you can go and visit a botanical garden and see lots of examples of those different types of stems and see if you can see where the new growth is. It's really great to do that in like late spring so you can see all the spring growth on them. All right, guys. Thanks for joining me again. I will see you next time. Bye.